I'll give you a little bit of an introduction. So I'm very fortunate and we are honored to have Martin here. He's been a friend of mine for years. And we're going to talk and share some wisdom about how to turn deep technical innovations into unicorn businesses that hopefully improve society. And I know Martin and I have had many conversations about visual technologies and photography and his background. You know, he's a very successful entrepreneur, but throughout all that, extremely thoughtful and genuine. He's also a professor and an investor. He's founded 8 companies, 3 with unicorn status in US, Europe in the last 30 years. And today he's focused on revolutionizing fertility as the founder and CEO of Overture Life, an automated embryology company, as well as founder and chairman of Prelude Fertility. And Martin, you're going to have to update me because sometimes your titles change faster than I actually know. So we'll talk about that in a minute, and just keep me honest, of course. Also, passionate about autonomous driving, a new company called Goggo Network, chairman of Gameto, and also invests via many different vehicles. We are co-investors in Synthesia, and there's actually another company that we can't talk about yet that we're about to be closing very soon. So very happy to have you here, have an interactive conversation, and thank you for joining us, Martin.
Yeah, no, happy to be here.
Great. Our audience, we've got a bunch of entrepreneurs, investors, and deep technical people. Obviously, there's very difficult times going on these days in Ukraine with COVID. I know you're headed, your family, I think, is still headed to the border to help the locals there. I'd love you to tell us a little bit about what you're going to do there, just for context, just because it's a challenging world today. And then let's get into some of your background and what you're working on today.
Well, I have 7 children, and I never thought that my youngest one is 5, and I never thought he would have such a hard first 5 years of his life. He doesn't remember a world without a mask at school, and now there's war, right? And so it's a pretty bad state of affairs compared to what we had to live through. Now the 90s look amazing. And even when we think of 9/11, COVID was giving us like 9/11 deaths per day. And now Ukraine is giving us 9/11 images every day. And so how do we deal with that stress? Personally, the sorrow, the worrying, and combine that with activities such as building great companies and doing well for yourself and society. So I personally continue to do both. I was very involved with COVID, helping the government here in Madrid appointed me the co-head of the digital strategy to fight COVID, and I worked at that. And now with Ukraine is more personal initiatives. So it so happens that out of my 4 grandparents, 3 are Ukrainian Jews. And I lost touch with family in Ukraine, except for one person. I feel close to this. I feel identified, but I think you don't need to be Ukrainian, you need to be Jewish. I think everybody who loves democracy and our way of life is identified. So concretely, I've started hiring Ukrainian refugees, also hosted them at home, having dinners. We had a dinner last night. Today we hired our first refugee. I think Europe, the fact that I spend most of my time in Europe, live in Madrid, Europe has done an incredible thing. The moment they cross the border, they have a European equivalent of a green card. And so you can hire them right away. You can work with Ukrainians right away, which is not the issue, let's say, when people flee violence in Nicaragua and enter the United States. And so I've been hiring, and I've also been, we're about to go to the border with a plan that's called Finansowa Osvita, which means financial literacy in Ukrainian. And we plan to train newly arrived Ukrainians on financial literacy in the European Union, teach them how to download and use the amazing fintechs we have in Europe, like N26, Revolut, Wise, and so on, and deposit the first €100 in their accounts, and then have friends and people we know to send money directly to them, but also to recruit CVs and try to get jobs for them. So it's a combination of financial literacy and hiring.
So I mean, I think the initiatives and all of that is obviously just a drop in the bucket, but every drop is very important, and it's fantastic that you're doing that, Martin. And the reason I wanted to start with that is because it's all about this balance you mentioned of business and improving humanity, and a balance of life and work. And I think a lot of people struggled about this for a long time. And one of the things we like to do during these fireside chats is talk about experiences in the past and how what you've learned either from successes and failures could help other people succeed and do better in balancing their goals. So let's take a step back towards your earlier days as an entrepreneur. And in our pre-summit interview, you said, after all these successes, but in the early days, you actually failed as a medical student, and your real estate business was challenging. In those early days, what do you think you learned the most? And how did that impact, the next steps towards successes?
Well, yes, I did. I was at NYU. I was in New York City. I had to flee Argentina as a refugee when I was 17, and Senator Moynihan gave us refugee visas into the States. So my life had a rocky start. And but before that, even in high school, the military government took over to the point that they appointed a military colonel to run my high school. And I grew so defiant of authority that when I got to NYU, I kept on that defiance. Like I was just a defiant person. At job interviews, people would say, "How do you see yourself in 5 years?" And I would say, "At least as your boss." Okay, and I had this, and that didn't get me very far. Certainly didn't get me the best grades at pre-med. So I didn't make the cut to enter medical school, even though I loved medicine, and now I work a lot with medicine, and I actually manage so many doctors. But at that point, I was unable to become one, and it was very difficult. And then yes, my father died when he was only 49, and I was left in a very fragile financial situation, and I had to cope with I would say tremendous adversity before the age of 25. My dad died when I was 22, and so I guess what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And then after such a tough upbringing, later on in life, when people said, "But how do you take such extraordinary risks?" I was like, this is nothing compared to growing up in Buenos Aires, and seeing a building bomb across my house in the middle of the night, which I saw. And so, yeah, it's all relative. If you survive a very, very tough upbringing, you can do great things later on.
The challenges, I think I've learned the most from my mistakes, and I've made many of them. And being on the edge, and when I was an entrepreneur for 18 years, and people said, "Why do you take such risks?" And I said, "Well, this is just normal to me, and it doesn't feel like a risk. I believe in solving a big problem and hopefully helping people." One of the companies you later founded is Viatel in 1990. Give us a couple sentences of why did you start that? You put $200,000 into it, and then 9 years later, it was worth $1.2 billion business. But it must have had times where it almost failed many times. Or was it always a rocket ship and it took off? What was a couple of examples?
No, it was it was not a rocket ship. It was a lot of ups and downs. So we started by inventing something that in the 90s that was called callback, which was a way of routing international phone calls through the United States, taking advantage of the liberalized nature of the US telecom market compared to the markets in Asia, Latin America, Europe, and so on. And that grew very nicely. But then other countries started getting liberalized, and then I pivoted the strategy. I saw liberalization was coming in Europe at the infrastructure level, and I convinced George Soros, who was my first investor, and I'm always grateful to George Soros as having given me a tremendous breakthrough in life, to build the first pan-European fiber optic network. But we went through a lot of difficulty getting the permits. The European telecom operators didn't want to comply with the regulatory changes. They loved the monopolies they had, and they almost drove us to bankruptcy. But then the company finally made it, and yes, we sold when it was worth 1.2 billion, and then I built the same story again in Spain, like the same idea, fiber optic networks all over Spain, fighting Telefonica, same difficulties. But again, that company, we also sold, or I sold my shares when it was worth around $1 billion, but now today, even 20 years later, is worth around 10 billion, and it's a very large operator in Spain. So yeah, those were difficult times getting started. But then,
Martin, let me just interrupt. So tell us a couple of examples, like when it was at the scariest times. And because entrepreneurs, you and I both know from being entrepreneurs and investors, majority of companies fail. And there's always these moments of, I can't go further, or I can't get past my most recent mistakes. But I think many people then do, and they find that energy. Or, I mean, are there certain tricks or ways that in the past that you've surpassed the impossible obstacles? And how do you emotionally deal with that?
Well, when you said I built 3 unicorns, I built actually 4.5, maybe 5, depending if you index for inflation or not. And in each one of those, I had moments of total agony, and I'm very close to failing. In the case of telecom and the case of renewable energy, was many times related to some monopoly that felt threatened and did everything they could to make our life miserable, and many times succeeded. And what, for example, they wouldn't give us interconnect. So we would have a lot of customers and they couldn't terminate the calls and things like that. And then the internet saved us because the internet came with plugged-in interconnect. Then we also had problems at the management level, problems. I always feel I'm a better visionary than I'm a manager. I don't think I'm a very good manager. I have better ideas about where the world is going. And so later in life, I started, quote unquote, firing myself early in the ventures. For example, Prelude now is such a success, and it's the largest fertility group in the States. And yes, I'm the founder, but a lot of credit really belongs to TJ Farnsworth, who runs it now and took it to tremendous growth. But now I realize that, and I even make contracts with my investors that I'm going to let go of myself into the venture. So I don't try to be what I cannot be, which is an organized, methodical person. That's just not me.
So that's very insightful. I mean, you've learned that over the years, and I think you've talked about it. I've heard you speak about that before. How do you find, everybody's looking for co-founders or partners or people to transition, people that are smarter than us to do things better. How do you find, what are the most important personality traits of those people that you want to transition to?
I wouldn't agree with what you said, that we are all looking for such people. In fact, it took me certainly time to understand that I had strengths and serious weaknesses. I'm not sure that people have that level of self-observance, but now that I'm more familiar with my weaknesses, I try to find in other people basically what I don't have. I tend to work with co-founders, or I hire CEOs to follow me who are great go-to-market CEOs. A lot of the things I do begin with moonshots. Even though they don't look like moonshots now, wind and solar energy were moonshots in '05, or fiber optics were moonshots in '99, or the consumer internet was a moonshot also at that time, especially in Spanish when we built ya.com, that we invested 38 million and we sold it for 550 million euros, which was like $700 million at that time. It was, people didn't even believe in the internet. They believed the internet was a passing fad. And when I said in 2016 that sex was great, but not to make babies, and I raised $100 million on the idea that sex was failing us as a strategy to become parents, a lot of people just didn't believe that. A lot of people said, no, sex is great to make babies. And I was trying to explain that we were experiencing the highest failure rates in history at having babies through sex because we were starting too late. And this idea of starting late was incompatible with success. And so I'm always working on moonshots. And so I am good at the first part of the company, which is to come up with a radical idea and make it palatable to investors. But I am not great at then the next stage, which is sort of the go-to-market stage. So, for example, you mentioned this company, Gameto, that we just raised $23 million for. Gameto wants to deal with ovarian aging, premature ovarian aging, which gives women infertility and menopause. And frankly, infertility and menopause are kind of the same thing, or they begin in the same way. And so I was the CEO of that company for the shortest time. I found an amazing CEO, and she's doing a terrific job. And so I now gotten even better at removing myself to chairman work with Dina in this case and a great team she's putting together. And so it's about realizing what you can do well and what you cannot do well and let yourself go. By the way, I'm actively recruiting for a CEO, and I don't mind saying it publicly, for Overture Life.
Okay.
In fact, before this meeting with you, I was doing that. And I plan to move on to chairman in that company too. So yeah, it's about finding people that once you have what you want, for example, in the case of Overture is this machine, which is a machine that uses microfluidics and uses biochips to freeze eggs. I want someone to help me with the go-to-market, to help me grow this company that can enable doctors of different kinds to enter the field of IVF and egg freezing, and it can improve IVF clinics. So yeah, so it's about letting yourself go at some point in the venture.
Yeah, I think that's very helpful, and I agree with you. Just looking back at your career, it looks like there's been a couple companies in telecom, and now recently there's Prelude, Overture Live, Gameto. I mean, do you feel like you find new veins or new kind of sectors that then you go deeper in them, or is it just it's part of your impact, as you mentioned earlier? You started wanting to I think part of the history of Prelude is dealing with wanting to have more kids and dealing with the IVF procedure that started that trend into these new companies, right? So, but do you see that you like to go deeper, or just kind of happens that these are companies and moonshot ideas that you think can improve the world and can make big businesses? I mean, how does your mind work as far as what interests you? Because there's only so much time in the day, Martin, which is like, I'm amazed with how much you do.
Let's say I don't think, I actually never thought, I'm going to build a company. Let's think, what kind of company am I going to build? The companies call me. I find the situation where the company is calling me. I feel that. I say, so I'm waiting at the IVF clinic, and I'm working on my fifth child, and I am struggling. I'm struggling with the way the clinic works. I'm struggling with the use of certain things, like in one case, fax machines in 2016, and I believe this is poorly managed, right? Poorly managed, and I get up. My first reaction is always to get upset, which is the reaction of most people when they see things that are poorly managed. So there's nothing original about that. Maybe the part that it's more original is that then I start getting this calling. I have to build something better. It cannot be that fertility is such a cottage industry throughout the United States. And then I say, let's build a technology stack and put it next to these clinics. Like, make these clinics work much better. And the Prelude network of clinics is that. It's just clinics that work better, that produce less sorrow and more babies, right? And that communicate better with the people, right? So I start companies in the most unusual situations when, and generally it's about some very frustrating experience that drives me to want to fix this situation. And then you could say, well, where's the frustrating experience with women? Why am I so into women's health, being a man, right? And some people have asked me that. And many times, by the way, I'm the only man at a women's health conference. And I'm a misfit in gender, and I'm a misfit also in age too. But I do have a frustration about how women have not been treated well by the medical profession. I believe that the medical profession has traditionally been men, and the result is that women have been disregarded in medical issues that only relate to women. And I also believe, of course, that there truly is a pink tax, and that things are sold for more money to women. And I made this a theme, and I built Prelude, then Overture, then Gameto. Now I'm working on something else that I can't announce yet, but very related to women's health also, because I believe women's health is society's health, and women's health is everyone's.
Absolutely.
So it doesn't have to be concretely about me, even though, by the way, parenting is about both, men and women.
Sure, absolutely.
But it has to be something that I find a deep flaw in society, something that's broken, something that's wrong.
So I think that's very helpful, and I want to touch back again in a little bit on the investing side. But first, let's talk about visual tech. And you mentioned in our pre-interview, and we know that Prelude is leveraging some visual tech, and tell us what also Goggo network from autonomous. It's critical to have visual technologies, and so tell us a little bit about what Prelude is leveraging as far as visual tech, and what is exciting you about visual tech these days, if anything.
Well, I am very obsessed with the analysis, with the machines analyzing images and machines understanding images. When you have an embryology lab and you have an embryo for 6 days that's being growing in cultured media, humans cannot just pay the level of attention that machines can to these embryos. When you change from a lab setting to a machine setting, and you have machines like these, and you have biochips, and everything happens in a biochip, and when you have optics in the biochip, you can know much more about what's happening to these embryos. And the same is true when people say, well, you're working on automating the embryology lab, and you're working on automating food deliveries. What does that have in common? And it is machine vision. And it is
Yeah,
the combination of sensors and it's not just cameras. Like a lot of people think cameras, but it's cameras, it's radars, it's
that's right.
lidars, it's
That's right.
audio sensors too. There are a lot of sensors. Let's call it. We could call it visual, but it's really a world of sensors. And I think these sensors emerged a lot out of the smartphone revolution. A lot of these sensors became affordable, available, and you can sort of deconstruct smartphones and smartphone technology and use it in many other things. Or you can also deconstruct the technology that is being used in autonomous driving and use it in other things. For example,
Right.
a lot of the work that was done in autonomous driving led to recognition and labeling of objects that then can be used in other fields, not just autonomous driving. So I'm always interested in how to apply technologies that being successfully applied in a certain field into other fields.
I think that excites me as well. I mean, I also, as you know, look at, I think the majority of data that we analyze as humans is visual, and audio and all the others are very important as well, and critical in taste and smell. But a majority is really visual. So I believe that every computer is going to see. And to your point, I agree. It's not just, the traditional camera. It's any visual sensors. And so for a couple of minutes, let's talk about, okay, you mentioned about what drives you when you start businesses. What type of, on the investing side, what gets you most excited? What type of entrepreneurs, what type of projects, are there certain personalities, like you're driven, you're passionate, you go deep into solving big problems, and they call you the startups? I mean, does that relate to similar types of people that you like to invest in, or do you have a different approach when you invest in people and startups?
Well, because I'm mainly an entrepreneur, even though I manage around 600 million of venture money, I tend to invest in the startups which I have a little envy, right? I see the startup, I'm like, oh fuck, I wish I did this thing, right?
And I agree. I love it. Yeah.
There has to be like a level of envy for me to want to invest. Like say, yeah, these people, they cracked it, or they're cracking it, or they're getting there. And so I invest in people I admire or secretly envy. Entrepreneurs that I feel are doing phenomenal work in fields that I just couldn't do or get involved, but at the same time they may be very common in my life. For example, I'm an investor in Cook Unity from the first round, which is this app that gets you quality food from chefs in New York and in all over the States, and the company has done very well. And Mateo put together a superb company that does that. Well, I'm never going to build a company that delivers quality food throughout the United States, but I'm certainly a consumer of them, and I admire the way he put it together, so thoughtful, every detail, and so I invest in companies whose entrepreneurs I envy.
That's great. I love it. So last question, and Martina, you and I can talk forever, and I think everybody's really enjoying it, but we only have a small amount of time and a bunch of great speakers coming. Actually, two questions, real short ones. One is, I like to ask entrepreneurs and investors, when they, what's their most favorite trait and least favorite trait in one-word answers of entrepreneurs. So if you're as an investor, you look at entrepreneurs, what is that one personality trait that excites you the most in a one-word answer, and what's the least favorite trait?
Well, that excites me the most is their tenacity.
Yeah.
And when I see that they have a tenacity, that they will just never give up, that there are peoples that will bite and they will not let go, and you will go like this and the people will be there. And so I really admire the tenacity. but there's something very close to tenacity that can be equally harmful, which is stubbornness or inability to see change or inability to see something that your tenacity may actually drive you off a cliff. And so it's a fine line between being tenacious and being stubborn. And I would say I admire one and I reject the other.
Yeah, that's mine is passion for what they're doing, and I think being selfish and not being team players is kind of the one that you can tell it's all about the one individual rather than the team impact of the world. On that note, Martin, I'm going to have to end our conversation. I wanted to thank you again for sharing your thoughts and your stories and your wisdom, and look forward to hopefully finding more co-investments and, more importantly, seeing you in person very soon. It's been too long.
Yes, same here. Thanks a lot for inviting me.